Hey guys, tonight we step into the unsettling scene of Bergen-Belsen just as the Allied forces arrive. You trudge through the muddy outskirts, eyes adjusting to a landscape where death and despair seem to cling to every inch of air. The stench thick, sour, nearly physical wraps around you like an unwelcome blanket. And you probably won't survive this visit without feeling a deep, unsettling chill. But before we fully dive into the darkness, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me where you are and what time it is. I like knowing who's on this late-night history trip with me now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in April 1945, at the tail end of World War II, as British and Canadian forces push through northern Germany. Is the Bergen-Belsen, a name previously unknown to most, suddenly becomes the epicenter of a horror no one was fully prepared to confront. You can almost hear the silence, screaming silence punctuated only by weak coughs and the soft shuffle of emaciated feet. Thousands of prisoners huddle like ghosts beneath the muddy grounds, their skin paper thin and their eyes hollow from starvation and sickness. The camp itself is a sprawling chaos of overcrowded barracks, open pits filled with bodies, and makeshift mass graves that smell like death itself. What you see defies most logic. The camp was not initially an extermination site, but by the time you arrive, it's a tomb for tens of thousands. The Nazis, in their chaotic retreat, abandoned Bergen-Belsen, leaving behind a nightmare frozen in time. You witness scenes where disease spreads unchecked: typhus, dysentery, and more, while food and medicine are nearly non-existent. One grim fact hits hard. Roughly 500 prisoners die each day at the camp, a figure so high it feels almost unreal. You quickly realize that the horror isn't just in the conditions, but in the scale of neglect and cruelty that allowed it to fester. Bergen-Belsen was not just a camp. It became a symbol of failed humanity. Even amidst the stench and sickness, the survivors' eyes hold stories, some filled with hope, others with unbearable pain. Interestingly, historians still argue whether Bergen-Belsen's true horror was the Nazi intent or the catastrophic result of war's collapse and logistical failure, but there's no debate about the shock felt by the soldiers who first arrived. Many suffered breakdowns and trauma just from witnessing what lay within as the Allied troops step into this grim tableau. The reality that confronts you is one that forces a reckoning not just with the Nazis who ran the camp, but with the depths of human cruelty and resilience. It's a place where the boundaries between life and death blur, and where every breath is a battle. So, as you follow along tonight, remember, this is more than just history. It's a window into a moment when the world had to face its darkest self and decide what justice might mean in the wake of such devastation. You step deeper into the campgrounds, the air thick with the mingling sense of decay and desperation. Starvation and disease saturate everything here, like an invisible fog clinging to your skin. The barracks, once orderly, now lie in ruin, crowded, filthy, and crumbling under the weight of neglect. Around you, survivors move slowly, as if their bodies have forgotten how to hold themselves upright. Their ribs press sharply against faded, stretched skin, and their eyes hold a vacant, haunted look. It's a scene so surreal you might suspect you've wandered into a nightmare, except it's painfully real. Bergen-Belsen's conditions are catastrophic, far beyond what most of the Allied soldiers had ever imagined. Food is a ghost. The prisoners have been subsisting on scraps or nothing at all for months. Disease has spread like wildfire. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis claim victims at a horrifying rate. The camp's water supply is contaminated, and there's barely any sanitation to speak of. You see the dead and the dying piled together, a jarring juxtaposition of life and death in the same breathless space. One survivor later described it as a hell on earth. Stavamos, a phrase that, while dramatic, barely scratches the surface. Oddly enough, the camp originally wasn't designed to be an extermination camp like Auschwitz or Treblinka. It started as a prisoner of war camp and a holding facility. But as the war turned against Germany, Bergen-Belsen morphed into a dumping ground for Jews and others displaced from other camps, becoming overcrowded and unsanitary to the breaking point. Historians still argue whether the extreme neglect was a result of deliberate cruelty or the collapse of Nazi infrastructure, but the result is indisputable. Bergen-Belsen was a slow-motion death sentence for tens of thousands. The cold reality of the place is punctuated by small, almost absurd details. For example, despite the overwhelming suffering, some prisoners tried to maintain slivers of humanity. One group secretly cared for the sick, while others tried to bury the dead to prevent disease spread. You might be surprised to learn that certain prisoners developed makeshift remedies using herbs, showing remarkable resilience. It's a testament to the human spirit trying to survive even the most brutal conditions. Despite these flickers of hope, the scale of death is staggering. The camp's records are patchy, but estimates suggest that tens of thousands died here, many within days of arrival. Too weak to survive the shock. The fact that prisoners often couldn't even digest the sudden influx of food after liberation only underscores how long and deep their suffering was. The psychological toll on those who entered Bergen-Belsen was immense. Soldiers who came to liberate the camp were unprepared for such an overwhelming scene of suffering and death. Many suffered lasting trauma, and the experience influenced post-war attitudes towards humanitarian aid and war crimes trials. This moment challenged the very notion of what humanity could endure or inflict. As you absorb these grim realities, you might wonder, how did anyone survive this place? The answer lies partly in small acts of kindness and communal support, often led by prisoners themselves, but also in sheer luck and willpower. It's a reminder that even in the darkest places, a light sometimes finds a crack. So, as you drift further into this story, keep in mind the complexities beneath the surface where despair coexisted with defiance, and where survival was a daily, brutal challenge. You watch as the first British soldiers and medics flood into Bergen-Belsen, faces pale and expressions frozen in disbelief. Imagine stepping into a place so ravaged that even the hardest war-hardened veterans falter. The air is thick with disease, the unmistakable stench of death hanging heavy. and the camp's horrors assault every one of your senses. Soldiers scramble, doctors wheel in makeshift beds, and nurses hustle to triage lines of prisoners whose bodies seem almost skeletal puppets animated by sheer will. Their immediate task is clear but daunting. Contain rampant epidemics while managing a human tsunami of suffering. The camp is a breeding ground for typhus, a deadly lice-borne disease, which spreads fast and furious in the squalid, overcrowded conditions. Medical teams set up quarantine zones and fever camps, but the sheer volume of cases overwhelms resources. You can practically feel the tension as soldiers cover their faces with masks, fumigate barracks, and try to stem the invisible tide of infection. It's not just the physical toll. The mental strain on these first responders is profound. Some British troops, fresh from battlefields, find themselves reduced to tears or near collapse as they confront this new form of horror. Psychologists later note that Bergen-Belsen was a key turning point in how combat trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder were understood, simply because of the magnitude of suffering witnessed here. Among the chaos, the soldiers start sorting prisoners into groups: those who can be moved, those needing immediate care, and sadly, those beyond help. Food distribution begins, but what seems like a blessing is sometimes a curse. After months of starvation, some prisoners' bodies cannot handle rich food, leading to a phenomenon doctors call refeeding syndrome, which can ironically hasten death. It's a cruel catch-22 that haunts relief efforts. Meanwhile, you catch glimpses of the soldiers' personal attempts to cope. Some write letters home describing what they've seen, their words filled with a mixture of sorrow, horror, and disbelief. Others turn to humor, unnecessary, if dark. One soldier joked about the camp's unofficial souvenir shop being just the piles of abandoned shoes and clothes. Historians still argue whether the Allied command was fully prepared for the scale of medical intervention needed at Bergen-Belsen, or whether the disaster could have been mitigated with earlier action. What's clear is that the camp's liberation forced a new era of humanitarian response and crisis management in war zones. Among all this, you realize that the soldiers' struggle to bring order and care is a race against time and disease. Every day lost means more lives slipping away, and the weight of that urgency presses down like the heavy April sky above. It's a stark reminder that liberation was not an instant cure, but the first painful step in a long, complicated process of healing and justice. The immediate aftermath of liberation unfolds like a grim and chaotic storm. You find yourself amid a whirlwind of activity that's part rescue mission, a part morgue operation, and part makeshift hospital. The British military faces a logistical nightmare. Tens of thousands of survivors too weak to walk, surrounded by tens of thousands of dead. The campgrounds are littered with bodies, some recently deceased, others in various stages of decay, creating a scene so surreal that it blurs the line between nightmare and reality. Burial operations become urgent and relentless. Mass graves are dug hastily in the muddy soil as a desperate measure to stop the spread of disease. You can almost hear the dull thud of bodies being lowered into these pits, a sound that feels both merciless and necessary. The soldiers tasked with this grim work are often former prisoners themselves, forced to confront the horrors of the camp under duress, their trauma deepening with each shovelful of earth. Meanwhile, makeshift medical stations spring up everywhere. Nurses and doctors, overwhelmed and undersupplied, attempt to stabilize the dying and care for the sick. The camp's infrastructure has collapsed. Clean water is scarce, sanitation is almost non-existent, and every day brings new waves of illness. The situation is so desperate that traditional medical protocols are often impossible to follow, and improvisation becomes the only option. You hear of nurses using whatever rags and scraps they can find to create bandages, and soldiers distributing water with a sense of ritual reverence. The survivors' plight is heartbreaking. Many are so malnourished that even the simplest movements sap their strength. Some prisoners, once vibrant and full of fight, now lie silent in blankets, barely clinging to life. You watch as families try to reunite, only to be separated again by illness or death. Among the living, there's a quiet determination, a fragile hope flickering in the faces of those who dream of freedom beyond the barbed wire. Yet, despite the humanitarian efforts, despair still lingers. The camp feels like a liminal space caught between death and the possibility of new life, where every breath is a victory and every sunrise a small miracle. British soldiers talk about the psychological challenge of maintaining morale, not just for prisoners but for themselves. Some resort to dark humor. Others find solace in simple acts like sharing a cigarette or a comforting word. Historians still debate the extent to which the British military's post-liberation management could have been better planned. The truth is, the scale and immediacy of the crisis overwhelmed even the most prepared teams. Bergen-Belsen became a grim classroom for future humanitarian missions, teaching hard lessons about disease control, nutrition, and psychological care in disaster zones. So as you imagine this chaotic aftermath, picture a world struggling to hold on to humanity amid the wreckage of war, where every small act of kindness is a beacon against the shadows. You move beyond the initial shock of liberation and into the complicated aftermath where justice begins to take shape. The Allies, realizing the full extent of the horrors at Bergen-Belsen, launch investigations to identify and prosecute those responsible for the suffering. Here, the story shifts from sheer survival to accountability, a shift loaded with tension, emotion, and the heavy weight of historical significance. Among the first to face scrutiny are the camp's guards, the people who carried out day-to-day cruelty. Some were men, but notably, a number of women served as guards. These known as Aufseherinnen. Their presence challenges some traditional notions about gender roles during wartime atrocities. You might find it surprising that female guards like Irma Grisi became infamous for their brutality, defying the stereotype of women as inherently nurturing or gentle. The British military begins rounding up suspects for trial. The process is complex, involving collecting testimonies from survivors, sifting through piles of evidence, and confronting a tangled web of orders and personal responsibility. It's here that you realize how difficult it is to untangle the many threads of guilt and complicity. Some guards claimed they were simply following orders, a defense that the trials scrutinized heavily. One particularly chilling aspect is the use of video footage taken by Allied forces shortly after liberation. This was one of the earliest instances of film being used as courtroom evidence in war crimes trials. The grainy black and white images show the horrific conditions of the camp and the guards' actions, leaving a strong impression on judges and the public alike. You can almost hear the murmurs in the courtroom as the footage plays, each frame a testament to the crimes committed. Historians still argue whether the trials did enough to deliver justice, or whether the chaos of post-war politics diluted accountability. Some critics say many perpetrators escaped punishment or received lenient sentences, while others emphasize the trial's role in setting precedents for international law. Among the accused, Irma Grisa stands out. She is often described as cold, sadistic, and chillingly efficient in her cruelty. Her notoriety makes her one of the most recognizable faces of Nazi female guards. Alongside her, other figures like Johanna Bormann and Elisabeth Volkenrath also face charges, each with stories that reveal different facets of the camp's brutal hierarchy. You'll find it intriguing that some guards, even amid their crimes, displayed moments of complexity, whether fear, regret, or denial. This humanizes the legal process but also complicates how we judge actions committed under an oppressive regime. As the trials begin, you witness the world grappling with profound questions. What is justice after unimaginable cruelty? How do we hold individuals accountable within a system designed for oppression? And perhaps most unsettling, how do we prevent such horrors from ever happening again? The Bergen-Belsen trials become a landmark moment, shaping the future of war crimes prosecution and human rights law. They mark the painful but necessary journey from chaos to order, from silence to testimony. The courtroom buzzes quietly as you settle into the grueling pace of the Bergen-Belsen trials. You're struck immediately by the sheer scale of these proceedings. 45 women and over 480 men accused of heinous crimes, their fates hanging in the balance. Each day is a painstaking dance of testimony, cross-examination, and the heavy burden of truth. You can almost feel the weight pressing down on the courtroom walls as stories of cruelty and survival unfold in voices raw with pain and anger. The accused sit solemnly, many trying to mask their fear with stoicism, others showing open signs of panic. The infamous Irma Grisa, often dubbed the Beast of Belsen, draws the public's fascination, her icy demeanor clashing with her youth. You find yourself wondering how someone so young could wield such cruelty, a question historians still puzzle over. What turns a person from ordinary to monstrous? There are no easy answers here. As witnesses take the stand, survivors recount their harrowing experiences. They describe the systematic abuse, the beatings, the starvation, the dehumanizing selections for the gas chambers that Bergen-Belsen miraculously escaped, but where death by neglect was just as effective. One survivor recalls how Johanna Bormann used dogs to terrorize prisoners, turning the camp into a living nightmare of fear and pain. The courtroom listens, rapt and horrified. Oddly enough, the trial brings out unexpected quirks. You hear of one guard's bizarre obsession with neatness despite the camp's chaos. She insisted prisoners' uniforms be impeccably folded, It's a small detail that feels almost surreal amid the vast tragedy, reminding you that cruelty often wears a human face, complete with odd habits. Historians still debate the extent to which the trials balance justice with political expediency. Some argue that, given the enormity of Nazi crimes, many perpetrators were let off lightly or escaped altogether. Others point out the groundbreaking nature of these trials, which helped lay the groundwork for international criminal law. The trial also marks a significant moment for women's history. These female guards, once overlooked in historical accounts, are finally exposed as active participants in the machinery of terror. Their sentences vary, with some receiving death penalties, others long prison terms. Watching this, you realize that justice, while imperfect, was inching forward. One of the most sobering moments comes when the accused testify, sometimes denying responsibility, sometimes showing chilling detachment. The courtroom becomes a theater of human psychology. Is a place where guilt and fear, denial, and truth collide in uncomfortable ways. As the proceedings continue, you understand that the Bergen-Belsen trials are not just about punishment. They're about remembrance, bearing witness to horror so it never fades into silence. This is history speaking directly to us, demanding we remember the darkest corners of human nature to guard against repeating them. The grim procession towards justice moves swiftly to the sentencing phase, and you find yourself in the courtroom again, where the final judgments begin to fall like heavy stones. Among the accused, 230 receive death sentences, marking one of the harshest reckonings with war crimes at the time. The hangman Albert Pierrepoint becomes a central figure in this chapter, an almost ghostly presence who would carry out over 600 executions, including many Nazi war criminals. Picture Pierrepoint's courtroom calmness, his meticulous professionalism, and his unusual reputation for being efficient yet humane in an unimaginable role. He claimed his task was simply to perform a duty as cleanly as possible, distancing himself from the politics and emotions swirling around. You might find it oddly comforting that even in such dark moments, some strive to maintain dignity. The executions themselves are conducted in a somber, methodical manner. Prisoners condemned to death walk to the gallows, with what witnesses describe as a mix of resignation, fear, and sometimes defiance. There's no spectacle here, just the cold mechanics of punishment. One quirky tidbit: it's said some prisoners tried to time their last breath humorously or cursed quietly under their breath. Small acts of rebellion in a final moment. Yet, it's the psychological aftermath that fascinates historians and observers alike. Pierrepoint himself later reflected on the emotional toll his work took, revealing the complex human side of a man executing such grim duties. Some argue his presence helped maintain a thin veneer of order and respect in a world unraveling at the seams. Historians still debate the ethics of capital punishment for war crimes. Was it a necessary deterrent or a simplistic form of vengeance? The complexity of administering justice after such mass atrocities remains a contentious topic, with some pointing to alternative measures like life imprisonment or restorative justice. Meanwhile, the execution symbolized more than punishment. They represented a form of closure for survivors and a stern warning to the world. Crimes against humanity would not go unpunished. Yet, for some, the trauma lingered, and the sense of justice was complicated by the immense scale of suffering. Outside the courtroom, you can almost hear the echoes of whispers among soldiers and survivors. Some felt justice was served. Others believed it was only a small step toward true reckoning. Either way, the execution cemented Bergen-Belsen's legacy in the annals of history as a site where justice was meted out, however imperfectly. It's a haunting chapter reminding us that the end of cruelty often demands a painful reckoning, and that justice is a path lined with moral questions as dark as the crimes it confronts. In the eerie quiet following the executions, the story veers into the lesser-known but no less brutal phenomenon of prisoner retaliation within Bergen-Belsen. You enter a chaotic limbo where freedom isn't quite freedom, where some survivors, embittered and traumatized, seek revenge against those who tormented them. Among these are the so-called capos, prisoners who collaborated with SS guards to enforce order, often brutally. Picture the tension survivors armed with years of suffering, confronting former tormentors who once wielded power over life and death. It's a raw and unregulated moment, where formal justice hasn't fully taken hold. Some acts of revenge are whispered about with a mix of horror and understanding. You can imagine how emotions ran high in these days when the line between victim and aggressor blurred. Prisoner reprisals, while sometimes seen as acts of catharsis, also highlight the moral complexities of liberation. The British Army struggled to re-establish order quickly enough to prevent these violent incidents, leading to questions about the challenges of post-conflict management. You might be surprised to learn that some reprisals were so severe that British soldiers intervened to stop further bloodshed. This chaotic aftermath underscores a broader historical debate. How should liberators balance immediate security with justice and reconciliation? Historians still argue about whether the Allies could have managed the camp better to prevent this cycle of violence, or whether it was an unavoidable consequence of decades of brutality. Adding an unexpected twist, some capos themselves were victims of circumstances, prisoners forced into impossible roles. Caught between survival and collaboration, their stories complicate the simple narratives of good and evil, reminding us that history is rarely black and white. In the midst of all this, you sense a fragile hope, a determination among survivors to rebuild their lives and bear witness. Their stories, told later in memoirs and testimonies, reveal both the scars of revenge and the seeds of resilience. As you reflect on this turbulent period, you realize liberation is not a neat line but a messy process fraught with moral ambiguity and human imperfection. It's a reminder that freedom, once seized, still requires healing and understanding to truly take root. You now find yourself stepping into the chaotic weeks after Bergen-Belsen's liberation, where the horrors revealed were so overwhelming that even the liberating forces struggled to manage the aftermath. The British troops who first entered the camp faced a scene unlike anything many had ever witnessed. Thousands of emaciated survivors, piles of unburied bodies, and rampant disease sweeping through the camp like an invisible killer. Imagine the soldiers, trained for combat but not for the crushing human suffering they encountered. Many were overcome by shock and disgust, some silently weeping behind their helmets. They scrambled to provide food, water, and medical care, but their efforts were hampered by a lack of preparation and the sheer scale of the crisis. The logistical nightmare was colossal. How do you feed tens of thousands who have been starved for years without causing fatal shock to their bodies? Here's where a tragic and lesser-known mistake enters the story. The introduction of rich, nutrient-dense food to severely malnourished prisoners actually led to a high number of deaths shortly after liberation. Their digestive systems, weakened and starved, it couldn't handle sudden refeeding. This phenomenon, known as refeeding syndrome, baffled and devastated medical teams. You can almost hear the frustrated murmurs of doctors struggling to save lives while unintentionally causing harm. Historians still debate whether the British medical teams had adequate knowledge or resources to prevent these deaths, or if the tragedy was simply unavoidable given the conditions. What's clear is that this mistake highlights the harsh complexities of post-conflict humanitarian aid. In addition to hunger, disease typhus, dysentery, and typhoid raged unchecked. Poor sanitation, overcrowding, and the presence of decomposing bodies fueled outbreaks. The military quickly implemented strict quarantine zones and began mass burial operations, but the camp remained a death trap for months. Soldiers tasked with burying the dead faced the grim reality of infection and exhaustion. An intriguing detail emerges. The British used German prisoners, including some former SS members, to help in the cleanup and burial efforts. This strategy was controversial but effective, turning former perpetrators into instruments of restoration. You might find the irony here both darkly humorous and profoundly symbolic. The scene at Bergen-Belsen post-liberation was one of desperate triage and overwhelming grief. It serves as a stark reminder that the end of war does not mean the end of suffering often. It marks a new beginning of healing fraught with challenges. As you follow the journey through Bergen-Belsen's grim aftermath, you encounter Joseph Kramer, the notorious commandant whose name still sends shivers down the spine of historians and survivors alike. Kramer's reign over the camp is a chilling example of how leadership or the absence of humanity can amplify suffering on a vast scale. Imagine Kramer's presence, a man whose cold efficiency disguised the brutal reality beneath. He was responsible for overseeing the camp during its darkest period, turning a place already marked by cruelty into a near-death sentence for tens of thousands. Kramer's leadership was marked by callous indifference, allowing disease, starvation, and neglect to run rampant. You might find it unnerving to learn that Kramer showed little remorse during his trial. Instead, he attempted to justify his actions as mere obedience to orders, a defense that still fuels historical debates today. Were these commanders merely cogs in a larger machine, or did they exercise free will in choosing cruelty? Scholars continue to grapple with this question, especially when considering figures like Kramer during the trial. Kramer was found guilty of multiple war crimes and sentenced to death. His execution in December 1945 marked a grim milestone, a tangible act of justice for many survivors. But even as the gavel fell, the shadows of his actions lingered. A lesser-known fact is that Kramer's brutality extended beyond the camp gates. He was infamous for his sadistic treatment of women prisoners, further cementing his notoriety. His personal cruelty personified the inhumanity that had pervaded Bergen-Belsen. Historians debate whether trials like Kramer's fully capture the complexity of individual responsibility under totalitarian regimes. Was justice served, or were these trials symbolic acts with limited real impact? The moral and legal implications continue to echo through international law and human rights discourse. As you absorb Kramer's story, you can't help but reflect on how individual cruelty, when combined with systemic evil, can create catastrophes of unimaginable scale. His trial serves as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked power and moral disengagement. In the quiet moments after learning about Kramer, you might find yourself pondering the capacity for evil in ordinary people. A sobering thought that lingers long after the facts have been laid bare. Now, you're stepping into the wider historical backdrop surrounding Bergen-Belsen's liberation and aftermath, a mosaic of military, political, and humanitarian forces all tangled in the chaos of war's end. April 1945 was a moment of both hope and horror, as Allied troops pushed into Nazi-held territories while confronting the staggering human cost of Hitler's regime. Imagine the Allied commanders receiving reports from the front lines, villages liberated, armies defeated, but also whispers of unimaginable suffering within concentration camps. Bergen-Belsen was one among many such camps, but its conditions shocked even the battle-hardened soldiers who arrived there. The liberation itself was a swift operation. British forces advanced with urgency, driven not just by military goals but by a growing awareness of the atrocities waiting behind barbed wire. You can picture the soldiers trudging through mud, their weapons ready, yet soon confronted by scenes that demanded more than bullets. A call for humanity and immediate aid, a quirky yet poignant detail. Some British soldiers, unprepared for what they saw, tried to use makeshift crocodile dung sunscreen made from local remedies because, well, you do what you can when faced with unexpected conditions. This anecdote illustrates the surreal reality of war zones and the strange improvisations that occur. Historians still debate the extent to which Allied forces were aware of concentration camps before liberation. Were they blindsided by the scale? Or did intelligence reports hint at the horrors? This debate shapes how we understand the moral responsibilities of the Allies at the time. Behind the scenes, political tensions simmered as the Soviet Union and Western allies negotiated control over liberated territories. Bergen-Belsen, located in what would become British-occupied Germany, became a focal point of post-war administration and justice. You might find it interesting that Bergen-Belsen's notoriety helped galvanize early efforts to codify international laws on war crimes and human rights. The camp became a symbol for the urgent need to prevent such atrocities in the future, influencing the creation of bodies like the United Nations. As you absorb this broader context, the complexity of ending a war becomes clear. It's not just about winning battles, but confronting the human wreckage left behind. navigating political rivalries, and laying the groundwork for a more just world. You're now walking through the stories of the female guards at Bergen-Belsen, women whose roles challenge common assumptions about who commits cruelty and how. The infamous Aufseherinnen wielded significant power over prisoners, sometimes rivaling their male counterparts in brutality. Picture these women not as passive observers, but as active participants, enforcing orders with ruthless efficiency. Some, like Irma Grise, became notorious for their cruelty, earning nicknames that echo through history. You might find it startling that Grise was just in her early 20s when she began her role as a guard, yet her actions were shockingly severe. Historians debate whether these women were driven by ideology and personal ambition, or the intoxicating effect of power within a brutal system. Some argue that gendered stereotypes obscure their culpability, while others highlight the unique dynamics of women in perpetrator roles during the Holocaust. A quirky tidbit: some female guards used their position to smuggle goods or manipulate prisoners for personal gain, blurring lines between survival, corruption, and cruelty. These human complexities add layers to what might otherwise seem like straightforward evil. During the post-war trials, many female guards faced prosecution and, in some cases, execution. The public fascination with their stories sparked debates about gender and justice. Why were some women held accountable differently than men? These questions remain open in scholarly discussions today. The presence of female guards at Bergen-Belsen complicates the narrative of victim and perpetrator, showing how totalitarian systems recruit individuals regardless of gender, shaping behaviors through ideology and circumstance. As you consider these stories, you might reflect on the broader implications of power and obedience. How does an ordinary person become capable of extraordinary cruelty? Bergen-Belsen's female guards force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. Their legacy, painful and provocative, serves as a reminder that evil wears many faces and that understanding history means acknowledging all its complexities. You now find yourself in the courtroom during the Bergen-Belsen trials, a place where the echoes of suffering are met with the cold precision of legal procedure. The trials represent one of the earliest attempts to reckon with the unprecedented crimes committed in the camp. A grim dance of justice unfolding amidst the ruins of war. Picture the defendant's guards, capos, and administrators facing charges ranging from murder to cruel treatment. Some appear defiant, others broken, all trapped in a legal system striving to impose order on chaos. The atmosphere is tense, heavy with the weight of countless testimonies and evidence. One fascinating detail is that these trials marked the first time filmed footage of concentration camps was used as evidence in a courtroom. These harrowing images brought the realities of Bergen-Belsen to life, confronting judges and jurors with undeniable proof of atrocities. Historians still debate whether the trials achieved true justice or served more as symbolic gestures of retribution. The legal standards applied were evolving, and many argued about the fairness of prosecuting individuals who claimed to be following orders. The proceedings also highlighted the role of survivor testimonies, whose first-hand accounts provided powerful personal narratives that transcended mere facts. These stories exposed not just systemic cruelty but individual acts of heroism and despair. A quirky, humanizing tidbit emerges. Some defendants attempted to plead ignorance or shift blame in surprisingly creative ways, occasionally eliciting incredulous reactions from court officials. These moments added a strange, almost surreal flavor to the otherwise grim proceedings. As you imagine sitting in that courtroom, you sense the monumental challenge of translating human suffering into legal language. The trial set important precedents, influencing international law and the prosecution of war crimes for decades to come. Despite their limitations, the Bergen-Belsen trials stand as a crucial milestone, an attempt to hold perpetrators accountable and provide a measure of closure to survivors. They remind us that justice, even when imperfect, is essential in the aftermath of atrocity. You now step into the somber moments of the executions of Bergen-Belsen guards, where justice, harsh and final, was carried out in the name of retribution and remembrance. This chapter of the story is grim but essential, revealing how societies seek closure after unimaginable horrors. Imagine the scene. A cold, a gray morning, the execution site prepared with somber efficiency. The guards, once figures of terror within the camp, now stand quietly awaiting their fate. Among them are the infamous Irma Grese and Johann Bormann, women whose cruelty earned them infamy and death sentences. The method was hanging, carried out by Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most experienced executioner, who would later become a subject of morbid fascination for his calm professionalism. You might find it striking that Pierrepoint reportedly regarded these executions as necessary duties, performed with precision and without personal animosity, highlighting the strange distance between the executioner and the executed. Historians still argue about the ethics and effectiveness of capital punishment in cases like these. Does executing perpetrators truly deliver justice, or does it risk perpetuating cycles of violence? These questions continue to resonate in discussions about how best to respond to war crimes, and a lesser-known fact is that some guards faced additional indignities, such as public humiliation or harsh prison conditions prior to execution, reflecting the intense emotions surrounding their cases. This blend of legal procedure and raw human feeling made the process both formal and deeply personal. As you picture the executions, you might reflect on the paradox of justice, the pursuit of moral order through acts that are, in themselves, irreversible and severe. The executions closed a dark chapter but opened conversations about memory, forgiveness, and the long shadow of trauma. This moment marks the bloody end of a painful saga, where the world attempted to reckon with evil through solemn acts of punishment. It's a stark reminder of the cost of cruelty and the desperate human need for closure. Now, you glide into the final stretch of this harrowing journey, reflecting on the aftermath and lasting legacy of Bergen-Belsen, a place where memory, justice, and healing intertwine in complex, sometimes contradictory ways. The camp itself was swiftly dismantled, its wooden barracks razed to the ground. Nature began reclaiming the site, with wild grasses and trees softening the harsh lines of barbed wire and empty foundations. Yet, The memory of what happened here refuses to fade. A memorial now stands, a solemn place for visitors to confront history's darkest moments and honor those who suffered. You might find it touching that survivors and descendants from around the world continue to visit Bergen-Belsen, each bringing personal stories and questions, turning it into a living repository of memory. It's not just a museum or monument, it's a place where history speaks directly to each visitor's conscience. Historians still argue about how best to preserve such sites and teach future generations. Some advocate for immersive experiences, while others warn of desensitization or exploitation. The balance between education, remembrance, and respect is delicate and continually evolving. A quirky but hopeful detail: there are beehives near the memorial, symbolic of life and renewal amid sorrow. These bees, busy and purposeful, remind us that even after profound destruction, life finds a way to continue. As you breathe in the quiet of this place, you understand that Bergen-Belsen's story is not just about death and cruelty, but about the resilience of human dignity. The camp's legacy challenges us to remain vigilant against hatred and injustice in all their forms. So, as you let these final thoughts settle, remember that history is not just a record of the past, it's a guide for the future. And in that, there is hope. Now, let your mind gently drift away from the harshness of these tales. Imagine a calm, soft light dimming, wrapping you in a quiet warmth. Yvonne, remember, the darkest stories teach the brightest lessons. Rest easy knowing that awareness and compassion grow from understanding. Sleep well, knowing you carry the memory of resilience and humanity forward. End of script. Sweet dreams.